Great. So let's dive into kind of this discussion of part 4. And the thing, if you jump down past those kind of bold-faced prompts and to get to Svidrigailof's motives and character, this is something to consider. What is it? Because in that, like I said, that paradigm I showed you or drew for you, I pinned him as this kind of holy, evil presence for Raskolnikov, in which all those presents became kind of manifest in part 3, that they're all there. Sonya and Raskolnikov have finally interacted. And Raskolnikov goes to meet Porfiry at his apartment, so they have interacted. And then Svidrigailov walks in the door at the very end of part 3. So they're all present in St. Petersburg. And now, as you see part 4 unfold, they all Raskolnikov all has significant dealings with all 3 of them. Svidrigailov, Sonya, and Porfiry in that order, I believe. And that's important, as Raskolnikov is battling, kind of bouncing from one to another, sometimes feeling kind of independent and self-assured. That's actually where he ends part 4, kind of in that place again, after the tradesman apologizes, and we can get to that and talk about it. But just let's look through some of these quotes that come from the very beginning of part 4, and they're all kind of just telling us a little bit about Svidrigailov, more information than we had known before, and which is going to lead to understanding his character. Svidrigailov claims that he is only human must give in to powers of love on one end, and then sometimes he talks about not giving into powers such as that. Here, Svidrigailov's just saying, I too am a man, I am capable of being tempted and falling in love. The whole question here is, am I a monster or a victim myself? It's very confusing around this kind of idea. And in terms of love, or who knows what to call it, lust, relationships with females, he is in town to do what?
Get married.
Well,
doesn't he say that he would get married?
Yeah, so if you look down, page 292, he does talk about, I shall marry a certain girl, and he talks about some marriage arrangement that has been made for him. What else is he in town to do?
10,000 rubles.
To talk to Dunya. Yeah, he's offering her money that is his, and well, seems to be his. Maybe stolen, maybe not. And he also has information that Dunya got money from what other source?
The will.
Marfa.
Yeah, so Marfa's will. That he says she only changed a couple days before she passed away. So again, and money and the exchange of money has been very prevalent in the novel, and it is so much with Svidrigailov. Now, depending on what his voyage is and what he plans to do with himself, we can look at his use or misuse of money as, frivolous and almost without meaning. I think there's a good bit of inclination or kind of foreshadowing here that he does plan to leave somehow, whether that's literally, and he kills himself. We know that motif has been part of this novel all along, that's an option for people. That's something Raskolnikov considers. We see a woman try to do that to herself. Or he means something else. He means to go to America. He talks about visiting America. But there's the word voyage is used a few times. He does ironically talk about his own conscience. For somebody we're kind of pinpointing as kind of evil, he talks about my own conscience is entirely at rest. 2 different times he uses that very same phrase. He talks about there's no calculation in my offer. You may not believe it, but later you and Avdotia and Romanovna will find it to be so. So he's offering this money. He says he just wants to talk to Dunya. That doesn't seem normal, or it seemed like it's possible, possible for him not to want something out of this, but that's what he claims. He does say overtly, "I've not, after all, taken the privilege of doing only evil." I mean, just to address that conundrum I find myself in dealing with Svidrigailov, that he is seemingly trying to do good in some respects. But if that good is just a guise for something else, then it's no good at all. And I would suppose that an evil entity or force that can somehow kind of show itself as good is worse than if it was wholly evil in its own way. And that might be kind of confusing, but that whole way to trick someone into something, it can occur if somebody has this kind of on the surface. He is he supposes he's going to do something kind for her. He does talk about seeing Marfa's ghost. These are these open bullet points here. And then there's a series of just not nice things that he seems connected to. There's a servant called Filka, and then I believe it's the same servant that's discussed 11 pages later named Philip. I think they're the same person. He talks about burying them. There's, did he kill him? Did he not? I don't know. But he seems kind of around when this guy has been killed. Again, the conversation of his own voyage is referenced. And then one of the last things that seems referenced is, I don't know how to say this, but somebody who worked with him, Resnik, they used the phrase deaf and dumb niece, and she was found hanging in the attic, cruelly abused by Svidrigailov. So you have this kind of intimation that he was involved in Marfa's death. You have these other deaths kind of now being discussed, some more overtly than others, being at the hands of Svidrigailov, but all important to kind of consider. And if he is kind of ambiguous, I think as a reader of literature, I often kind of try and figure things out, and then sometimes it's just nice to I think sit back and just say, well, that is purposely confusing. Like his morality might be ambiguous to us. We might not totally understand him as totally evil, and that's okay. And then just step back and say, well, then what does that ambiguity do as a craft of the novel? That he wasn't just there, bearing a knife and running after Dunya. He's there saying he's going to be nice. He doesn't want anything. He has this money, but he still seems pretty darn creepy. And his motivations seem unclear, I guess. So that's a bit about Svidrigailov. Do you guys have any questions about him? Kind of who he is, what role he's playing?
So we don't really know. He just kind of shows up, moves in next to Sonya, listens in, says he's good, but he has a bad history. We don't really know.
Was he the one who followed her
Yeah.
at one time when she was...
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, and we don't know that until kind of we get information later.
Okay.
But yeah, he's moved, and it was, I can't believe that was just by chance that he moved it next door. But he has. And now he's going to, What does Raskolnikov say at the end of his conversation with Sonya?
We'll find out.
Yeah. If you're here tomorrow, or if I'm here tomorrow, you'll find out who killed Lizaveta. There's this guy listening through the door, and wanting to use Raskolnikov, right, to access Dunya. So, to what advantage could that information serve Svidrigailov if he actually gets it? And he might feel like he's already gotten it by just the gist of the conversation and something so kind of overt as that statement at the end. Any other questions about Svid? What do you guys want to talk about from part 4? Is there anything in particular you come in with questions about? I I can certainly roll through this, but it's going to be a pretty one-sided conversation. Yeah.
When Rodian is leaving the family after the breaking off of the proposal, or not the proposal, the marriage, does Razumikin know? Because I was kind of confused on whether Razumikin knows that Raskolnikov did it and murdered, and I wasn't sure. It was kind of left a little open-ended, and did he in fact know? Was that like communicated or not?
It's a great question, and I think it was like 98% communicated, and kind of missing that last 2% to make it totally clear. On page 314, and if you flip the notes on the second page, the very top of the page, it actually kind of addresses this, or at least points it out. Right, so Raskolnikov gets up and he leaves this meeting. He's in the hallway. Razumikin goes out to the hallway and approaches him. And on page 314, and kind of in the middle of the passages before the end of chapter 3, you have this. Razumikin gave a start. Something strange seemed to pass between them, as if the hint of some idea, something horrible, hideous, flitted by and was suddenly understood on both sides. Razumikin turned pale as a corpse. And that's almost all you get. The very last line of chapter 3 is, in short, from that evening on, Razumikin became their son and brother. Talking about the family. If we go down the path, and I would say that he knows now, and he seems pretty dedicated to helping Raskolnikov from the get-go, and I think we've kind of questioned why, because he seemed to be such a do-gooder in that respect. He does have some interest in Dunya, so that complicates it too, but it makes it maybe all the more reason that he wants to lend a hand. Yeah.
If Svidrigailov like 10,000 rubles to Dunya was just for breaking off her marriage with Lutzin, then why doesn't she want to take it after she broke off her marriage?
I think she just understands him as evil in that way, and wants nothing to do with him, no matter the pledge. Yeah, Annie?
On that same page, 314,
Yeah.
I was just wondering who I was. Maybe I missed something, so all of a sudden it switches.
Yeah, the narrator does this very occasionally. Right, the narration goes into the I voice. I will not describe here what went on that evening at Pulcheria Alexandrovna's, how Razumikin went back to them, how he tried to calm them, how he swore that Radia needed to be allowed some rest in his illness. Swore that Radia would come without fail, would visit them every day. He was very, very upset, and that he should not be irritated, that he, Razumikin, would keep an eye on him, would find him a doctor, a good doctor, the best whole consultation. Which is just it's bizarre on a couple levels. It's bizarre because we switched the I voice, and it's bizarre because he's saying, I will not describe here, and then goes on, ironically, to describe all the things he said he wasn't going to describe. Purpose of that? I'm not sure. But from the I won't just, from the I will not describe here part. But the purpose of the rest of it, I think, is important to understand, to probably back up an understanding of, well, I think Razumikin would know what Raskolnikov did. If at that moment there's such a turn in his kind of devotion and support of this family as well. Yeah, but that's a good point about the shifts in narration there. There's also a weird shift in the narration, and we'll talk about it at some point today, when we have this like limited, it's third person, but it's like a limited point of view, and then we're with Luzhin all of a sudden, and like his kind of really creepy thoughts.
You kind of talked about it a little bit, but I just wanted to hear what you thought. Like, what is Razumikin's motivation? Because like I was thinking he was, trying to make a romantic move on Dunya, but then at the end he says he's his brother and son or whatever, which just kind of confused me.
Right.
And like
You wouldn't want to marry your sister.
right, exactly. And what's like what do you think his motivation is in this whole kind of like business ploy that he sets up?
I think most of it is him just being kind of this do-gooder character. Also just kind of representing this side of reason, the thing that Raskolnikov is losing. He's losing his ability to reason things out, and so we have kind of a foil in Razumkin in some ways. Even just to say, okay, let's regroup. We could start a business. I'd do this, you do that. We could make this work. There's just that level-headed kind of approach, opposite of Raskolnikov. Yeah, and then the Dunya thing is important, I think, too. He's got the hots for her, why not try and kind of help them out, make himself look good in the process. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
There's a discussion how Elizaveta gives Sonya a cross and a copy of the Bible. Does that have any significance at all?
Yes. It just didn't. I think, in terms of kind of bringing up more kind of biblical references or kind of overt spiritual kind of symbols in the text that start to surround Raskolnikov on one end, and then just that Raskolnikov seems drawn to on the other end, and being drawn to it, I don't think he understands why. I think from from stepping back from the eyes of somebody like Porphyry, we would say that of course he is. He's that quote that's up there on the ceiling about the moth being drawn to the flame. Porphyry is kind of looking at it as like a legal, with a legal lens, like I'm here, he'll come back, I know he will, he won't be able to give this up. But there's that same sense around being drawn ultimately to spirituality, to becoming a believer, through faith, through ways that you don't necessarily determine on your own. So I think that it's important. And then he is then the connection of particularly Elizaveta's death to this, I think, is important. If you go with the face of this movie cover, that being really the sin, and it's interesting that in some ways that the murder of Aliona doesn't seem to affect him, because I think it does leave open the door to the conversation about, is the Superman theory like a viable thing? Could he have been one if he had just killed Aliona? Would he be okay? Because it is the mention of Elizaveta, and it is occasionally his own perseverating over her death that really bothers him. Yeah, Joe?
So on page 317, Sonya brings up ghosts again with her dead father. Does that just signify like sort of a madness, or does it have any greater
The ghosts?
ghosts in general?
Yeah, because we have Sergei talking about seeing the ghost of Marfa in Sharia talks about seeing Marfa dressed all in white. She doesn't say she was a ghost, but then we come to find out that she had passed away, so maybe it's a ghost. And then Sergei talks about the ghost of Filka, the servant, coming in. So yeah, you're right that this is becoming more of a established motif. What exactly we make out of it, I think we can make some various determinations, but I think it's a great connection to things like spirituality and like the fact that we are connected somehow to one another, and that whole world of like the subconscious, which I think Dostoevsky is kind of writing about, not necessarily as a textbook on psychology, but through this. You can keep an eye on it as the rest of the novel develops, I guess. It's my best guess at the moment. you guys want to let's look at the illusion narration quickly. On the second page of these notes, just the second the second thing on the page talks about a shift in narration, going from that general third-person narration that follows primarily Raskolnikov around to all of a sudden we are with illusion. And just as a point of comparison, I put two quotes here. I think one is, if I have this right, one is from page 302, where this is what Lucian is saying in front to others at this meeting with Raskolnikov and Razumikin and Pulcheria and Danya about marriage to a poor girl. He says that marriage to a poor girl who has already experienced life's grief is, in my view, more profitable with regard to matrimony than a marriage to one who has known prosperity, for it is better for morality. So that's what he says, right? But by page 307, in the beginning of chapter 3, we get these like horrid images of what he's really thinking. And then you get this, the narration shows us that what Lucian's thinking, and this is one quotation, thinking about the same topic. It sounds a little different though. In deepest secret, he entertained rapturous thoughts of a well-behaved and poor girl. She must be poor, very young, very pretty, well-born and educated, very intimidated, who had experienced a great many misfortunes and who was utterly cowed before him, a girl who would all her life regard him as her salvation, stand in awe of him, obey him, wonder at him and at him alone. Sounds like any guy you would want to marry or you would want your daughter to marry.
No.
Yeah. I guess, like, some people, like, that's it. Anyhow,
It's just like so specific. Like she has to be like poor but like well born and educated.
oh yeah.
How does that work? I don't know.
Well, let's just say we'll get to know
maybe they
that
invested too much in the stock market.
the girl that is arranged to be he is arranged to marry. We don't get this information yet, but I'll tell you this: that he has to. There's some like waiting period because she is not yet 16, and she has to wait until she's 16. And
Wait, how old is
he's
he?
like for Svidrigailov, he's in his 40s.
Oh my god.
And you get that information later on, but then again, that's how we start to develop a sense of who Svidrigailov is, and like, okay, how can we get that Svidrigailov using his own money to basically buy this bride, buy off the family, and the same guy who turns around and donates money to certain kind of causes, which I guess I'll stop kind of explaining some of those things because they come out later on.
Who is arranging his marriage? Is it him? Because normally that's like a parent arranges a marriage for their child. But
Yeah, he's been in communication with the parents. I kind of forget if there's been some kind of other
They said something
marriage
about
arranger.
matchmakers.
What?
I thought they said something about he went through a matchmaker.
Yeah, yep. I think you're right. So it'd probably be the matchmaker in contact with him, and then this girl's with parents. So it's interesting because he talks about not liking Lucian, Lucian and Lucian's relationship with Dunya, and that Lucian's using her, and like you have him turn around and do that times 10. He's a man of contradictions, and that's why he interested me, I guess, from analytical standpoint, to say, what do you do with this guy? Sonyas Apartment. We're just jumping around here a little bit. There's some description in the middle of the second page of notes. The general description of the apartment comes on page 315 in your text. But as we enter into this place, there's tons of adjectives like broken and bent and barn-like, irregularly ugly, terribly acute, depths, weak-like, grotesquely obtuse. And it's really interesting. I think you get this this sense of space in a girl who lives there that we understand as unaffected by kind of what she does in her surroundings. So what better place to put her in kind of this kind of ramshackled apartment. And Sonya enters, I think, with little imagery, with a candle. A moment later, Sonya came in with a candle as this kind of light, this kind of symbol of goodness in the novel. That when Raskolnikov is disturbed by his meeting with Svidrigailov and then his meeting with Luzhin, and then he kind of shuts down while the family kind of figures out what to do next, and he just leaves that meeting. This is where he's going. He's drawn there, and I don't think he understands why right now.
I just thought of the candle thing, and like the quote, "You're drawn to the candle" and stuff. And he's drawn to Sonya, and
Yeah.
her, and she's holding a candle as well.
Yeah. So I think there's that world of Porphyry sees it from a criminal legal standpoint, and then I think with Sonya we get the spiritual standpoint. But in many ways, there's a lot of similarities between those two. What you're going to get with a difference is if you go that whole way, right, from a criminal standpoint, all you have to do is say you're guilty.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what you feel about what you've done. But if you go into the police and admit that, then that is that, and you deal with the repercussions. But from a spiritual standpoint, that doesn't quite work. There's something more needed than that. What would you say is needed? Going down that kind
Some
of
sort of reconciliation.
What makes reconciliation possible?
Remorse. Repentance.
Yeah. So it'd be remorse and repentance. So you start to talk about these kind of nouns, or in some cases adjectives, that would describe somebody who's wholly and unequivocally sorry, remorseful for what they've done. There's no inhibiting factors in that remorse, which then I think in a spiritual sense would allow for a place of redemption in some ways, which is much more difficult and complex than going to the police officer and saying, "I'm guilty, lock me up." That's a fine line that's related to our kind of morality, but doesn't determine it. And again, I think from the get-go, that's what Dostoevsky is playing around with. These things that kind of are in line, but how they are still different as well. When you step over things, what's the difference between stepping over a law and stepping over and transgressing, doing something really against kind of your moral fiber and kind of a shared kind of moral boundary among all of us. Let's keep here with Sonya for a second, and then we'll talk about Porphyry. So the story of Lazarus comes up pretty specifically and pretty detailed on page 324. Raskolnikov asks Sonya, "Where's the part about Lazarus?" And he's he came up for him earlier when Porphyry asked him about it. Like, do you believe in the story of Lazarus? And he seemed kind of put off or confused at that moment, and he was rightfully just kind of on edge. But in this moment, he's not only gone to Sonya, but he's asked her specifically about this part of the novel. The novel. It's part of the Bible. Can somebody kind of story tell for me what is the story of Lazarus?
He Jesus hears that this guy who believes in him, Lazarus, is sick or has died, and then he goes there and realizes that he's been dead for 4 days, and he's a relative of the dead man, I believe. Lazarus begs him to bring him back to life, sort of says that if you had been here, he wouldn't have died, and then he brings him back to life.
Raskolnikov needs something like this. He might not have literally died, but he's spiritually dead, perhaps. Psychologically getting closer and closer as he unravels. Is in need of something like this. I guess it's just interesting that he is drawn to the story, and then he'll come back. He'll want that this story is read again. I think 2 more times in the novel. Kind of foreshadows what goes on with him, kind of ultimately. So any questions on Sonya before we jump to Porphyry? If not, I'd like to talk about Porphyry and that whole interaction, particularly the my little secret that he talks about, and how that went wrong, what really happened, what was supposed to happen. And if we talk for 5 more minutes, that's great, and then we can kind of stop this conversation, move into groups, and work differently, I guess. So how does Raskolnikov end up at this police station?
Goes there.
He goes there on his own volition, right? He's like, I'm just gonna go talk to that Porphyry guy. Let's find it. So on by page 339,
I thought he was going there to file the claim on the watch.
on the watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. That's kind of we go back to Foster for a moment, and like the stated reason versus the real reason. And yeah, the watch definitely is the stated reason, and then he gets in this huge battle of I don't know. I wrote on these notes kind of a battle of wits and a battle of psychology, in which they both really kind of test each other. We get that moth to the flame metaphor on page 340, and then by page 3. So there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of talking about psychology. And then by page 349, Porphyry asked, "But don't you want to see my little surprise?" As Raskolnikov had previously seized his cap and walked to the door. He's ready to leave. So what did you make of this? What is Porphyry's plan? Doesn't work. Something else happens. But what does he want to happen?
Well, he has that guy who came up to Raskolnikov in the street and called him murderer, and I think he turned out to be in the pawnbroker's apartment when Raskolnikov went back to the scene of the crime, and so he was kind of going to show that to Raskolnikov and make him confess almost.
Show what to?
He was the guy from the pawnbroker's suite was waiting outside, and Porphyry was gonna bring him in and kind of hoping that would trigger Raskolnikov's confession, or at least put him closer to it.
Yeah, he kind of wanted that to play out again, for this guy to come in and say you're a murderer, and see what Raskolnikov's reaction is, and if it's enough of a reaction that he kind of breaks, as Porphyry I think thinks will ultimately happen, and he kind of admits to this crime. Yeah.
This is a little off topic, but it's a bit similar. When I was younger and I was playing hide and seek, if I knew that someone was in just one room, I would say I can see you, and then the person would be like, who, me? And I'd be like, yeah, you. And then I would find them. So it's when you kind of get the other person the mentality that oh, I know they already found me, then they kind of let the defense down. It was very effective.
That was kind of champion.
Yeah.
No big
It was
deal.
pretty manipulative now that it came about.
What happens? How is this little surprise ruined?
One of the painters comes in and like, confesses that he murdered her.
What do we know about this painter from previously in the novel?
Do you try and commit suicide?
Yeah.
Yep.
I thought-
Wasn't
he was
he-
accused.
He's accused, and he has already confessed. But this is different. There's some kind of scuffle at the door, and Nikolai, the painter, throws himself down in this room with Porfiry and Raskolnikov, and just kind of admits again there that he is the one. So, in terms of Porfiry's plan, he wanted to bring the tradesman in and rout Raskolnikov, and what ultimately happens is Raskolnikov feels pretty good about himself and where he is in terms of kind of guarding his own emotions about giving himself up, because now he was at the police station. This other guy kind of admitted to it. So that's often kind of confusing as you read this and look at it. And how does this part end, part 4, narratively, plot-wise? Where are we? Who's there? What happens? Yeah.
So the guy that had previously called Raskolnikov the murderer, who runs into him again, or he sees him, and he's basically like, the only thing he'd actually seen was Raskolnikov going back to the apartment. And now the guy basically just apologized and was like, now that Nikolai has confessed, like, I wrongly accused you. So then Raskolnikov is left just feeling like pretty confident.
Yeah. Great. So because there was the mix-up there, Nikolai came in, threw himself on the floor, and admitted wrongly his own guilt. The tradesman not only is pushed out of the way, and not only does that not happen, but he sees this unfold and really seems to feel bad about it and believe in it. So yeah, that's why the tradesman then. But again, kind of creepy, right? He follows him, to his apartment. The door slowly opens. It's the tradesman standing there, and then he kind of apologizes. And so then we get, we get the end of this. This part where Raskolnikov's feeling pretty sure of himself again, as that keeps changing during the course of the novel. They use the term, it's kind of random, it's just the last thing on the notes here. They use the term sharper a lot, or at least a handful of times in this part, and if you didn't look it up, it just means a cheat of some sort. Sometimes a gambler, could kind of mean a cheating gambler, something along those lines. Any other questions?
So the tradesman is in the room. Is he hidden behind something? Or
In Porphyry's?
yeah.
Yeah, he's...
I have trouble visualizing.
Yeah, so there's a conversation about the tradesman, and I want to be able to find it real quick, being hidden behind a partition in the room. And so there is a scuffle at the door, and maybe it's not the tradesman that's pushed out of the way. There's somebody else maybe not letting him in, being pushed out of the way. And I think the tradesman, right, is behind this partition, kind of ready to come out when he's kind of requested by Porphyry. Like it was set up in advance in some way, but that doesn't happen because it's kind of interrupted.